Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Every Damn Day. Today on the show we have our new friend Max, who's getting himself a cup of coffee real quick. How you doing today, Max?
Good. How about yourself, Jerry?
It's great. So people might think, why is he drinking a cup of coffee at 2 p.m.? But you're not in our time zone, are you?
That's right.
Where you at today?
I'm calling in from Los Angeles, California. So a little bit far away from Michigan this time of year.
And your friend MY Michael was over at the house last night. He's back from California, and I saw him last night. So glad to have you. Thanks for getting up and doing the show with us and all of that. So let's jump right in. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Max and a little bit about the projects you're working on?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks again.
Yeah.
So my name is Max Offerman. I am 23 years old, originally from Michigan. Just recently graduated during the coronavirus epidemic back in spring. So March area hit, and I was really in this position of, wow, what is life going to look like? There's just so much more uncertainty on the other side. I just recently finished my degree in environmental studies and sustainability. So I at least had that much figured out of, okay, here's kind of the direction that I'm heading in. But now everything is up in the air, which is just to say that before even my move to Los Angeles, I was still putting a lot of the pieces together. But now I've ended up in a position working on two different projects, one of which being Force of Nature, and that was a project started back in 2019, but launching this year in 2020 over the pandemic with an environmental activism sort of psychology of agency, a couple interesting focuses there. And then for the last few years, I've been working on a project with an old roommate, close friend of mine, that deals with modular clothing. So thinking of how we can design solutions within the fashion industry.
I always get it wrong, but help me. Tamosha. Tamosha and I, we met a long time ago when he was working out of the Hatch at MSU. So yeah. And I'm really happy to see that project still moving forward and going on and all of that. A real quick detail, if you don't mind. Where were you born in Michigan, and where'd you grow up, and what high school did you go to?
It's always interesting because people ask me where I'm from, and there's sort of two answers to the question. I was originally born in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I was adopted at about 18 months old. And for the sake of answering your question, I'm also from Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is where I was raised, where I've grown up. I went to high school there. Eventually went to East Lansing for college at Michigan State. But I feel like that part and just recognizing my adoption has just been such a fundamental part of my story. When at some point in high school, I really had this deep sense of gratitude instilled in me when I was looking into the Russian orphanage system and kind of much lower than average life expectancy for Russian orphans, and just kind of the situation surrounding that with the US being banned from Russian adoption since 2013. And I really realized through that just how unique this opportunity and this life that I have really is. So yeah, that's just to say that I'm from Russia, but also Kalamazoo, Michigan on the west side.
So now we're not going to talk about any of your projects. I just want to know about the Russian but it's super interesting. And I was going to ask you about that ban and what you thought about that, but you kind of mentioned it.
Pussy Riot, I think.
Well, I said ban.
We can go into that.
But Pussy Riot's my favorite Russian punk band, by the way. So super funny you said that too. Told you we'd have a similar value system there. But no, I think you probably, I would love to talk about it more if you want to. But if you want to talk about your projects, if you want to talk about Russian adoption, anything. I'm open.
Yeah, I'm a total open book here. I really mention it just as an integral and very honest part of my story. To recognize that where I'm at today and being in a position where I've really started working on understanding myself and what it is that I want to bring into the world, to the point of having these 2 projects now that I work on. It definitely did not start as an isolated incident. There's all of these things before that led up to this moment now. And kind of understanding that background of being adopted from Russia and what that means on a larger scale in terms of opportunity, in terms of privilege, has just been very important to me. Yeah. But yeah, to that end, we can talk about it later, as little, as much as we want to, honestly.
Well, it'll probably swing back into our conversation as we go through, right, your journey your journey is a pretty long journey, an interesting journey, in your short kind of 23 years. I'm old, so I'm going to say short 23 years. But what's that?
You're experienced.
Yeah, experienced. I do learn that as, especially as I talk to younger people, they're always looking at my language when it comes to old, young, stuff like that. And I think that's very good, because I do remember being 23. It was a long time ago, but not that long ago. And I'm very interested to talk to you more. So let's get into one of your projects. Let's pick one of the 2 or the 2 that I know about and get into it.
Yeah. So there's Force of Nature and there's Peaceware. They both have slightly different focuses. They're kind of born out of that same desire of, for me personally, how can I help people change the world? But then also changing the world, right? And creating a world that's by our design. Like, how can we design new solutions and kind of invite forward a new vision of what the future might look like? And so wherever you want to start on that front.
Well, let's start with the clothing company. Sure. And go to Force of Nature as the kind of almost a lead into that, I think.
You bet. Yeah. So Peaceware, in terms of story, was started by my friend Timosha that we were talking about in the beginning. And me and him both met when I was a sophomore in college. So back in high school, I was always really interested in streetwear. And this is just the culture that I was sucked into, or whether it was just a result of me seeking external validation, whatever it was, I just became very obsessed with it. There's a whole subculture oriented around exclusivity, limited drops, having clothing that's less accessible. So, just higher priced for the same t-shirt. But it buys you an image, it buys you representation. And I totally not only bought into that, but it was a reseller of clothing. And that's just to say that it was a background that I was coming from. But then sort of had a huge shift in values my senior year of high school, when I was trying to think, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And I ended up in an environmental studies degree thinking, well, okay, trying to save the world, I guess, sounds like a noble enough answer. Sounds like something I can get behind. And I didn't even know about the environmental impact of the fashion industry until sophomore year when I met Timosha. Because Peaceware was a project that he had kind of mentally started, was up here in just going into any retail store and seeing the same type of t-shirt over and over again. The only difference being a different graphic on the front. And it was just simple pattern recognition at that point of saying, well, if the only thing changing is the pattern and the patterns between all these different styles, then why are we making an entirely new garment? And thus, Peaceware was born, as a concept, at least. And so we've spent the last few years now prototyping, doing business competitions, failing business competitions, and really figuring out our identity as a brand, how sustainability can be approached in the broader market, approaching streetwear culture from that lens of sustainability, and really getting clear on defining what it is that we seek to do with our clothes. And that's all to say and to summarize, I suppose, is that we are trying to design solutions. We're trying to create better clothes by design and introduce these new systems for interacting with clothing. And how we do that is by making modular clothes. So clothing that has interchangeable or removable components. And we have two products that we're just kind of prototyping, playing around with. One that we're more set on launching with, and another that's be like a larger capstone project, all around that idea of reducing consumption by design. So sustainability doesn't become like this thing that you have to opt into or is a challenge or a chore, but is more of an invitation, a different way of living. And the first product would feature a removable and interchangeable front graphic. So I'm not sure if you've seen that one. I know I had it lying around somewhere. But
well, do you mind if I tell you a quick story about how I met Tamosha?
Yeah, I would love that.
I was sitting in the hatch in East Lansing on Grand River there at a table with, working on probably some paperwork for some other project. And this guy walks in and seemed like just tons of layers of clothes on. And he's like, "Are you Jerry? They told me I need to talk to you." And he starts, unzipping his sleeves and taking his sleeves off. So he's got this long sleeve sweater on, and the sleeves, all of a sudden it's a short sleeve. And he's talking to me about what you're talking about there. And I want to be able to do this. And I'm big into slowing down the fashion industry. I think that fast fashion, that you'll go into the environmental impact, I'm sure, later, but it is a huge drain. And then the consumerism that gets laid on top of that, we're always carrying to buy. And then I see the brunt of it when all these clothes get donated to me every time around Christmas time or whatever, where people the clothes still have tags on them. They bought something just for that consumerism. And I just fell in love with the project. And so I have seen that design. And I think it's a very cool thing. You have so many places you could go with that. So sorry, I interrupted you, but that's how I was first introduced. And I remember that day very, very clearly, meeting him.
I appreciate that. And you articulated one of the best points. And it's something that even on our journey, we've realized needs to be talked about differently. And it almost makes an interesting segue into force of nature. But a lot of sustainability and a lot of kind of what goes into being a brand that has, that is mission driven, is how do you articulate that? Because what we found was that these numbers, how much water we can save with modular designs, the resource efficiency. There's like a few statistics in there that really stick with people, and there are those big ones that you can get. But what we found with Piecewear is it's a really interesting project in how to make environmentalism inviting, but also kind of the norm. A lot of sustainable clothing right now looks like organic cotton and recycled materials, and these are huge steps in the right direction, but they don't represent a large change in the market. It makes up about 1% of clothing produced, and it doesn't change our actual consumption habits and how we're perceiving clothing, the utility that we get out of it. It's still seen in its own separate category, and quite honestly, does not appeal to the broader market. So Piecewear to me represents this unique bridge between larger consumer culture and this aspect of humanity that we see as challenging and really want to take on and address, but don't seem to know how to, as well as environmentalism, which is largely where humanity needs to go, but we're trying to figure out how do we really incorporate this in a way that's seen more as an invitation than as a loss, or perceived loss.
Yeah, I love that. More of an invitation than a perceived loss. I love that statement right there. Segue into Force of Nature.
Yeah, so Force of Nature is an entirely separate project started by she's now 21-year-old climate activist out of the UK named Clover Hogan. And we got in touch over the course of quarantine. And by way of story and kind of where I got to and in this aspect of my life, It dates back a bit to when I was around 13 and first started struggling with depression. And it really became a huge aspect of my life that, was just front and center, confronting me every day. And being young, figuring out my identity and how to navigate the world while also just constantly asking why, and feeling like there was something wrong with me. Now, I went a lot of the traditional routes. I did therapy, I did medication for a while, and I really made a lot of progress after first discovering meditation the summer after my senior year, which is to say that, things improved, and I could always kind of have this positive, show up with a smile on my face. But then I got to college and went through one of my first real breakups, and also was starting an environmental studies degree, which told me every different way that humans were destroying the planet. Needless to say, that didn't help at all. And over the next 4 years, as I continued learning in depth about all of the different ways that humans are harming the planet, damaging our natural systems and biological loops, never once did a professor mention, here's what to do if this makes you depressed. Here's what to do if this makes you anxious. And through those 4 years and just reflecting on my own experience and kind of the existential crises happening on a daily basis, and the nihilism even that can kind of manifest, I realized that we were missing productive and meaningful narratives on climate change and how to cope with that. So I started working back in February, and it's kind of hit a pause, but I started working on a little zine. So like a short, sort of mental health guide to climate anxiety and to climate change. And it was through that process in researching the phenomenon that's been called eco-anxiety, which is just any sort of anxiety that comes, anxiety, depression, fear, grief that stems from the climate crisis or reporting on the climate crisis. I started doing research on that, found Clover Hogan's article. I sent her a DM over Instagram. She didn't answer the first one. I sent her another follow-up one, and then we quickly connected over a Zoom call and realized that we shared a mission and a vision of how we can actually approach this. And thus, that's how I came to Force of Nature, which I haven't talked about at all yet. So
that's okay.
Yeah, just by way of a brief summary of Force of Nature, we really see those feelings of powerlessness in that shutdown as a problem that is equal to, if not greater than, climate change. So our work is in helping people step up rather than shut down to become capable, effective, and active in bringing solutions to the climate crisis. And that's just kind of a neat way to put it, yeah.
Well, man, that's so interesting. I got a couple of little follow-up questions. When you were 13 and you were suffering from depression, was that eco-anxiety that you didn't identify as that, do you think? Or
Right. So when I was young, it didn't come from climate change, right? And climate change wasn't even largely on my radar. It was much more of this sense of, well, just feeling like something was wrong with me. And also just kind of having this internal fear and insecurity around the future, which is to say that it wasn't quite from climate change specifically, but I think moreover, just because it wasn't on my radar at the time. But I had the thought for the first time in middle school when we were learning about World War I, World War II. I was thinking, well, there's going to be some type of catalytic event in my lifetime. There's no way that humanity is going to go this span of time. And I don't know what it was, but something in me was just aware of that, or just had a deep belief that that would be the case. And now I kind of see that as climate change. But more broadly speaking than me, there's research from Friends of the Earth, so focusing on, they're a UK-based organization that polled and had found 74% of youth ages 18 to 25 experiencing anxiety or depression from climate change. More research coming out had shown that 54% of child psychiatrists in the UK had also had patients that were expressing anxiety over climate change. And those are just the ones seeing psychiatrists, right? It really, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing that there's more out there that aren't seeing psychiatrists.
Right.
So
It's interesting now because it's not exactly, it's not a new phenomenon, right? For as long as humanity has faced challenges, there has been anxiety in the face of those challenges. And very frequently, especially in frontline communities and those that are already being impacted by climate change and are having to leave their homes or having their entire way of life dismantled in front of them, they need to take action. They need to take action to survive. And so eco-anxiety now is manifesting a little bit differently. One, it's in response to climate change kind of in its entirety rather than isolated environmental events. And then on top of that, two, like those responses are very diverse and are very frequently happening as a result of these anticipated threats.
mm-hmm.
So this uncertainty of not knowing, especially growing up in Michigan, where we have our fair share of environmental issues, but climate change to me didn't look like drought. It didn't look like wildfires. It didn't look like food insecurity. It looked like reading about all of those things. So there's this kind of larger sense of anxiety happening around these anticipated threats. So imagining what these threats are going to look like and having that be the only way we interact with it. And then the third kind of kicker there is that as a generation, this has become my issue. I do remember the days of not being aware of climate change, but then as soon as it kind of entered my field of vision, it was impossible to look away from. It's become impossible to ignore. And very frequently, in kind of the work that we do in Force of Nature to move past this point, is that we see the anxiety manifests in two ways. On the younger end of the spectrum, it very frequently manifests as despair. So this is all the nihilism. This is all the talks about societal collapse, the absolute dystopian visions of the future where people 40 years from now imagine the future of flying cars and all diseases being cured. And when we imagine the future, we just speaking to young people very broadly, it tends to look more like something out of a dystopian Hollywood blockbuster. So it very frequently manifests as despair. And on the other end, generally in older generations that are perhaps a little bit more socialized to the societal structures that we have and the ways of life that they knew growing up, it very often these emotions manifest as denial. And I don't mean that as outright climate denial. I mean, we're talking about climate change on major news outlets. It gets a ton of attention. Shell is even coming out with climate ads. Climate denial in a very strict black and white sense isn't so much the problem, but this more subtle denial of, well, the problems might not be as bad as we think, or the technology of tomorrow will save us. We'll come up with these solutions in time. There's no need to worry. Just kind of pacifying that and kicking the problem down maybe 5-10 years.
Do you think that Amazon does that with their, we're going carbon neutral or whatever their big commercial is? That
it's so tricky. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was actually watching YouTube videos on these companies' different commitments. I was watching Apple's, watching Shell's, watching Microsoft's, just to get a better pulse here. And the whole thing is that, yes, it is in fact a step in the right direction. But it's kind of a question of how bold these initiatives are and how meaningful they are, whether or not there's a plan and a structure to actually implement them, and who this change is going to impact positively. Because goodness, all of these industries have so much more to change than just their carbon consumption, right? They need to be looking at where they get their resources, how much they're paying each step of their supply chain, how that wealth is being distributed, and if they can do that sustainably, if they can keep on making these products, if they want to, and I mean implementing full circularity for those products, and so many other steps that are more than just looking at carbon emissions. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's also not very ambitious, right? By 2050, you see a lot of these campaigns. And it's, so what are we doing for these 30 years in between that when we needed to start addressing these solutions yesterday. And some of the work that we do in Force of Nature is helping facilitate that change and bring Gen Z voices into these larger companies. So we've worked with the likes of PepsiCo and Procter & Gamble to sort of not only bring Gen Z to the table and give them a seat at the table, but to give them a table entirely to themselves. Yeah. And start being like, we as young people aren't as socialized and aren't as, we don't have the blinders on, so to speak, of, here's what we need, here's what we have to do. And we can think outside of the box about these things and really say, well, what is the change that you want to create in the world? You want your company to be here 100 years from now. This right here is the opportunity of a lifetime. Never before, maybe since like the .com boost, was there such an open invitation to revolutionize your company and then have everybody in the industry try and follow you. We've already seen it with big tech and their carbon neutral commitments. Shell is one of the first oil companies to come out and be very, at least run an aggressive PR campaign around it. Also start making some of these more ambitious goals and just recognizing the writing on the wall. And it's just, do you want to be first in line or do you want to be last?
Yeah. So I love that. So we're going to come back a little bit to Force of Nature in the question that I'll have for you in a moment. What do you do every damn day to move your mission forward? And I think your mission's very clear that you want to save the earth. You want to do actionable things now. And then also I'm very much interested in that eco anxiety, right, and that impact on more than just, what we might be lacking in resource in the future, but also what we're doing to people, even their thought patterns and all of that. If they're anxious about that, do you plan for the future or are you in despair all the time and you're curling up in a ball? So what's something you do every damn day to move this big, big mission forward that I love, by the way?
Yeah, thank you for that. For me, it's looked a lot like reflection, journaling. Actually, I have it right here. Yeah, just by way of...
I have mine right here.
Yeah, so the secret already. Every damn day, I'm reflecting on this mission and kind of on what my own vision of the world might be and how it is that I want to work towards that. I think it helps keep me grounded. It helps keep me clear on my path, and it helps me figure out what some of those next few steps might be. Just having something to work toward and being able to clearly kind of look back and write honestly and openly with myself about where I'm at so I can critique and improve and adapt to move forward.
See, I like that. These two phrases have been stuck in my head as you've been talking. One is that a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So that 30 years away seems like forever. But I loved what you said. What are we doing today? What is the plan? There's a lot of environmental problems happening. What are we going to do about these fires? We can't wait till 2050, right? Okay. Especially where you're living right now. It's really starting to show its kind of ugly head. Yeah. And then the other is that rivers are made with drops of water. And I've always loved that about the youth movements, is that you understand that so much that, you can be, you right here, Max, can be very impactful on the entire world. And if you get all of you guys, how much very, very, very impactful that would be. So kudos to you for this mission. Right. And it is your world that you're going to inherit. None of us, people my age, we're not going to be around I hope to be around in 2050, but it's going to be a crickety walk up the steps. That's for sure. You inherit our environmental problems. You inherit our debt. You inherit our technology and the way we design the technology. You inherit our algorithms and our social media. And I like that you are stepping up and through these different youth movements, if you don't mind me calling it that, to take control of that future and have a say in that future. And I cheer for young people all of the time, or younger people, I guess.
Well, thank you. We need your support.
So yesterday, and there's a lot of us out here who support you, by the way, despite what, you might not always feel that, but there's a lot of us like me who believe in what you're doing and want to get behind what you're doing and want to make sure that your table's there and crisp and clean and ready to go. And then to step away and make room for you all, because it is your future too. It's actually more of your future. You have more future than us. So I always daisy chain the shows together. And yesterday I had Figgins and Casey that help build the Lansing area free stands, and they do like these different card games for like kind of conversation starters. And I think they have an environmental change or a climate change one, but I have to look into that, and maybe I'll send you a link or something. They're all free. It's low profit company, stuff like that. Their question to you is, what distinguishes you from other movements like that? And they were in particular talking about force of nature, and I also think they had in their mind the sunrise movement. How are you guys different? What are you doing differently than what they're doing?
That's a good question, because certainly a lot of we are entirely Gen Z led and operated. Our oldest team member is 24, and so we certainly share that side with a lot of these other climate movements. And I would just say that we have a little bit of a different focus. We don't direct the action, right? We don't come in and say, here's what you need to do in order to take action on climate change, by way of kind of the banner blazing in the streets and the petitioning and all of, how we traditionally think of environmentalism. Our work is much more oriented around facilitating the shift in minds that leads to those sort of actions. So really unpacking the emotions and the internal environment that precedes those sort of actions. So establishing, speaking to kind of these stories that we tell ourselves, where very often it's, I'm too small to make a difference, or the system is too broken to fix, or everyone who does take action is smarter than me, better than me, et cetera, et cetera. When we work with young people, and we've facilitated online workshops now with, I think, over 400 youth around the world, just in this first year. So that's been incredibly exciting. But in a lot of the cases, we just merely give them the agency and give other young people the space to talk through these emotions, to validate them, to understand that they aren't alone in feeling this way. And actually, those emotions are one of our greatest assets, because they lead us to action. Underlying all of our decisions, one way or another, is an emotional connection of some sort. And we tend not to think of action that way, but when our story that we tell ourselves is, I'm too small to make a difference, I don't expect that I can make a difference by banner blazing in the street or signing petitions. My attitude is generally pretty pessimistic about the whole thing, and I decide to stay home that day. But when we change that first story, and which is very much our focus here, to one of, well, here's what I can change, here's what I can do. Very much the stories that the people, the people that have already changed their minds are going out and joining groups like Sierra Club, joining groups like Sunrise Movement, joining these other larger environmental movements. It's a huge sense of community. But, very often that action kind of ends there. It's like, okay, you took step XYZ and now you're done for the day. So how can we create a longer, sustained change that's actually involving us taking action on the projects that inspire us, that motivate us, that play to our intelligences, or that are taking on problems that we as individuals want to solve? Like you mentioned earlier, there's a ton of opportunities to change everything in the entire world to become more sustainable and more aligned with Earth's natural cycles. That's the goal here, right? We preserve our habitat, we get to keep living here. It's a pretty good deal. And there's just so many of these different problems to take on. So how can we facilitate that connection? And there's a lot that goes into that that's worthy of its own kind of hour-long discussion. But I would say that aspect is one thing that separates us, that we don't necessarily give a clear action plan other than figure out what it is that inspires you the most and what problem really motivates you and gives you energy, and make that clear connection between your emotions and your decisions. But then we also facilitate these conversations with the CEOs in those boardrooms, making the decisions that are making us anxious to begin with. And again, like framing it in terms of that opportunity where we see 16-year-olds that are, or 18-year-olds that are in Sunrise Movement, pointing fingers at these executives and saying, you know, hey, you need to change the way that you're doing business. You need to change fundamentally everything about how you operate. And then the people in these boardrooms that Clover's talk to, they turn around and they say the exact same thing. They say those 16-year-olds, those 18-year-olds, they need to demand a change. We're powerless to change anything because we just need to bring in profit. They haven't made that connection that converting to a sustainable model and revolutionizing an industry is one of the most profitable actions you can take.
Right.
So we take that a bit farther, and I would say those two things kind of distinguish us, or rather, they're our niche. They're the niche that's been missing within the larger environmental movement.
Yeah, I think that, lean manufacturing, elimination of waste, things like that, you're saving money and you're protecting the environment. If you're slowing down, I always love the quote that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And by slowing down and eliminating waste and doing these things is a great financial reason. I worked for a company in Grand Rapids called Cascade Engineering that was one of the first I ever heard of triple bottom line accounting, where they looked at, yes, the financials, but also their environmental impact and their social accountability.
Right.
So is your website forceofnaturealliance.ca?
No, it is forceofnature.xyz.
Oh, forceofnature.xyz. I want to put that out on the comments.
Yep.
XYZ. All right. So tomorrow on the show, and I've got more to talk. Oh, I wanted to ask you one thing you reminded me of. Do you know what the Gaia Hypothesis is?
I feel like I've heard of it, read it, skimmed it, but refresh my memory.
It's the thinking of the Earth as a living organism within itself, and we're just members of that organism, cells, components, if you will, and that, whenever we say we're going to save the Earth, we're really talking about, and you've said this, we're really talking about saving ourselves, because the Earth's going to be just fine. She'll keep moving around the sun, and she'll bring life back when life's ready to come back, and it'll be just fine, but maybe just not without humans on it. So it's kind of
this very real question proposed, and kind of what you get from the more meta thinking environmentalists. I mean, right, when we talk about saving the planet, we know that we're ultimately talking about preserving a habitat for the human species, and living ideally alongside the planet. The question that comes up is, what do we want this future to look like? And so far, I mean, from what I've seen in leadership and in these executives and with all of these global promises, is a lack of that vision. And that's something that we need to, as a generation, get very clear on. And also thinking of what we're going to be leaving behind. What is this future that other young people are going to be stepping into? And what do we want that to look like? And to speak to what you're saying about this disconnect from nature, and truly where our lack of vision has brought us, it's at a point where the United Nations can come out and say that they estimate human population to be at, 9.5 billion, almost 10 billion by 2050, 8.5 by 2030. And it's like, there's no plan for what that is supposed to look like. And it's not like these challenges that we have now are just going to go away. Each of these problems represents a solution for change, and we need to start getting very clear and very encouraging about taking on those challenges.
Yeah. I just want to throw a comment up there. Max, you have a brilliant mind. So this is this is our good friend Effie. So thanks for that, Effie. Let's move on to the next part of the daisy chain and the shows together for a moment, and I'll come back again. Tomorrow on the show, I have Jose from Tante, which is a Peruvian restaurant that's trying to get going in Lansing. And you have one of my favorite questions I've heard so far for him. Tell us what that question is.
Jose,
I'll pass on to Jose.
What did you want to be when you were 5 years old? And is it at all related to what you're doing today?
And I love that question. And I'm very interested in what his answer is going to be, but I'm also very interested in what your answer will be. What did you want to be when you were 5? And are you doing it, or is it close? Or
I forgot about this component, that you would flip it around. Yeah. When I was 5, I wanted to be an inventor and also a marine biologist. I think inventor came first. My mom had told me that my grandpa, when he was alive, had a few patents, and obviously I had no idea like sort of what went into that. I think it was for like different creams or ointments or something like that. But I remember thinking that was cool and just imagining kind of the stereotypical mad scientist. And where I'm at today, ending up on the entrepreneurial side, it's not quite the same as the inventor in my mind with a bunch of beakers and lab equipment sitting around. But very much I feel like I'm staying true to creating something new and bringing that into the world. So a little yes and a little no.
Yeah. And the same with, well, actually, let me ask you a different question. Did you always know you were adopted from St. Petersburg, Russia?
I think I found out when I was in maybe 3rd or 4th grade.
Okay. And did that influence you as you were on this journey to where you got to now, in what you might want to be or what you might want to do?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's an absolute identity crisis in a way. I mean, I definitely had those angsty moments as a child where, you know, you find out, it's probably not that relatable, but it's like you find out you're adopted, and kind of that first angsty response is, oh, so you're not my real mom. Now, obviously, for all intents and purposes, my mom is my real mother, and I love her exactly as you'd love a real mother. And, you know, my mom did a good job of kind of exposing me to other adopted families and to Russian culture and really normalizing being adopted. So much credit to her for that part. But the way that it shaped my journey, kind of like as I was talking about earlier, finding out that the life expectancy for Russian orphans that aged out of the orphanage, turned 18, were let out, was only 30, you know, middle-aged at 16. That was kind of like it was a very hard thing for me to wrap my head around. And it was really interesting to me as I was in high school reading about cruelty and neglect in Russian orphanages. And keep in mind too, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And we're talking like their entire government social structure collapsed. And needless to say, orphanages as part of the state system, and just kind of became very compartmentalized, you know, and there were some very real human impacts on that. And when I learned too of kind of this geopolitical trouble between the United States and Russia, where it's called the Magnitsky Act, if anybody wants to look into it further, but it was essentially, you know, the US saying Russian officials couldn't do financial transactions in the United States. Russia retaliates and says Americans can no longer adopt from Russia. And this has been ongoing since 2013. And what really stuck with me from that was this realization that so many other kids will not share my journey. Being where I am now, having found a calling, found something I'm deeply passionate about, and having all of these wonderful experiences that I've had. And that's not to say my life's been perfect, but that's to say I'm grateful for the life that I have. Just because I realize that so many other young people that share my original upbringing don't get that story. So that's kind of how it factors into my life.
I usually don't do this, but I'm going to ask you one more question that we didn't quite prepare for, but I think you're ready for it for sure. What's your thoughts on the American dream?
Well, what's that one quote? You got to be asleep to believe in it.
I love that.
You know, I mean, let's talk about the elephant in the room here, right? The C word, capitalism. It is framed, and I mean, it's very. Let me rephrase. I'm very grateful to be able to be in this place of relative privilege, not only as a white male, but just of my own like financial upbringing. I mean, God knows I was not wealthy by any means, but I've been able to more or less like break even since being out here. I was in a position where I could go to college and I could find and discover these things about myself. And now I'm very grateful to have this opportunity where I can bring something into the world, make it my own, try and make a living off of it. That's very inspiring to me. And I mean, hey, like that's what that system is in place for. Do I think that negates any criticism over this so-called American dream and all the criticisms that come with who has access to this American dream, who's allowed to believe in it, who has the privilege to believe in it? That is an entirely different conversation, and one that's quite frankly pretty worth having, because I recognize that not everyone can just up and leave their life and try and throw together something like this. And I mean, a lot of people try and a lot of people fail too. This should not be the only way that you're guaranteed a livelihood or that you're guaranteed to find fulfillment. I think that all of us have so much by way of untapped human potential that just gets thrown in a cubicle for the next 40 years of our life. And then we retire. And now that's even up in the air. I just read a report about Social Security running out by like 2035. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean, what that looks like. But I think the American dream only works so long as the people of our culture and in America uphold it and keep it going. And what we're seeing is a generation of youth and older generations that have laid this groundwork to make this possible, that are saying, yeah, we can go beyond civilization. Just like when when the first candle was invented or when the horse and buggy came around, we didn't stop and say, no, this is the absolute best. There's no improving. But for some reason, we share that same attitude towards civilization and toward the society and the structures that we've set up. When in all honesty, I believe that there's something different than us, something better than what we've come up with lying around the corner. And I mean, people are already implementing the solutions to enact this vision and to bring it forward. Revolutions don't happen when all the buildings get burned down. It happens earlier than that, when the minds start changing. And I think that's very much what we're seeing play out. And I know that kind of all stemmed from the American dream, but I think a lot of us are starting to wake up, dealing with just life outside of those dreams.
I wanna show you one more comment. You are so inspiring. So just people saying that. And then there's a book I'm reading called Utopia for Realists that talks about we always have to have a utopia to kind of chase, and that, you know, even people living in poverty on the east side of Lansing today are living better than the nobles in the 15 and 1600s, but it's still not good enough. And what you hit on with the American dream, and especially capitalism has lost its moral compass. To be innovative, to be inventive, to be creative, to be entrepreneurialist is not being a capitalist. Those are things that push us forward and push our ingenuity forward. And I think you are spot on. You are inspiring. And I usually ask you to take us out with something as the guest. But I'd really like to just really emphasize something you said, because it is so very important. And I think it's what's happening now. The revolution starts earlier. It starts with a change of mindset. And that is such a very important statement that you just made, Max. So important. But I'm not going to take it away from you. You want to take us out with something else?
Everything that I talked about today, whether it's peaceware, whether it's force of nature, and even just only kind of scratching the surface of both of those things, recognizing that is my story. And when we talk about climate change and these larger social problems, very frequently we talk about it in terms of that whole, right? But we know that these problems are the results of broken systems. And I think everybody is in a position where we shouldn't necessarily be focusing on solving these problems as a whole. And I mean, it's kind of one of those reasons that individual action not only gets shit on, but gets praised in a lot of ways of like, well, people say, yeah, bring your own bag to the store, go vegan, reduce how many flights you take a year. And there's kind of two takes on that. Like one being, well, I don't think that this will solve the problem. I don't see how it solves the problem, so I'm not going to do it. And the people that just kind of do their part and say like, well, hey, it helps solve the problem by this much. And we need to be somewhere kind of in the middle. And what I want to leave with you all today, if it's any encouragement, live in that middle. You know, don't necessarily go at it with the expectation that, okay, making these individual choices will solve the larger problem, but just look for ways in your life that you can start inviting forward this new way of how we could live. Every day you have an opportunity to represent an entirely different way of thinking and living in the world and in society. And I think that's what all of us, whether or not we're an activist, right? You could be a doctor, a dentist, a teacher, a community supervisor, whatever, and still be living with this new thought and this new idea of what it can mean to be human. So that's what I have. What I have today, I suppose.
And he's a very special gift to us all. So a lot of affirmation from the crowd, a lot of inspiration that you're doing. And Max, I am so very happy that you came on the show today. So you stick around with me. We're going to say goodbye to the crowd, and I will see you later.